This former soldier reincarnates as a high school student and becomes a prodigy. Shin was part of the ancient elite of society, but suddenly returned for his last year of high school. Now, he wants to make changes and improve his relationship with his friends. The story begins with our main character, Shin. He covers part of his face with his hand and looks forward. There's a starry sky and a full moon in the background, as well as a tall building where the young man is. Suddenly, a middle-aged man in a company of girls compliments the main character, addressing him as Mr. Shin. They toast with wine glasses. The man's face is bright, and he praises the promising young man. Shin looks calmly at the man and, rejecting the compliment, the man hesitates due to his strangeness, but continues to offer more alcohol. He even asks the boy to trust him and not worry about anything. However, the protagonist disapprovingly looks at his companion who still drinks in an attempt to distract him. The main character carefully looks at his reflection in the wine glass. He starts thinking about his name and sees that he no longer recognizes himself. The young man confidently affirms that everyone around him is a true hypocrite and they would treat him differently if he weren't a millionaire, including the old man and those girls sitting on the sofa beside him, who are definitely fake. The protagonist is soon introduced to a girl named Zan Minzai. The girl says that the young man's wife is extremely lucky, but the man points out that Shin is single and currently an eligible bachelor, which makes Zan embarrassed. She sits beside him and notes the sophistication and high standards of Shin. Then she holds a business card in her hand, mentally begging for an opportunity to be noticed. Zan quickly approaches the young man and begins to shower him with praise, talking about the importance of balancing family and career. Shin listens to her silently. Then she leans against him and carefully hands him her business card, asking him to take it. The protagonist looks with a faint smile as she's happy that he took her business card. There's a bottle of alcohol on the table and the man realizes that the young man has barely drunk, but still offers a ride to take him home. Shin firmly refuses, citing the fact that his house is close enough to go alone, right? Then, the young man sighs heavily and approaches his car, holding his jacket in one hand and grabbing the door handle with the other. Suddenly, he's distracted by a loud meow near his car's wheels. It was a small orange cat. Shin picks it up in his arms, saying that the kitten was lucky to have been noticed. Otherwise, it would have turned into a pancake. Shin releases the orange kitten and it quickly runs away, turning to look at the main character one last time. In the darkness, Shane's bright headlights stand out brightly, and the protagonist sits peacefully with his eyes closed in his car, relaxed in the front seat. As soon as he opens his eyes and looks back at the car window on the street, he sees that same orange kitten with two other adult cats. At that moment, the protagonist remembers his own family and realizes that he hasn't visited them in a long time and wants to do so. He starts the car and puts his hand on the gearbox, preparing to drive home. Shin sits with his seatbelt fastened and his hand reaches for his shirt pocket. Among the large number of cards, he sees Zhang's business card with a lipstick mark. The young man looks thoughtfully at the large number of cards in his hand and then throws them all away. The cards are scattered chaotically and fall on the ground near the car. Shin starts the car, causing some cards to fly further away and some he simply runs over. The protagonist drives away under the lights of the night city. Many skyscrapers are visible in the background. Shaman has one hand on the steering wheel and the other supporting his chin. He looks out the window while listening to music. After a while, he looks back at the track and his hand firmly grips the steering wheel. He confidently increases the speed, following the song's lyrics about 500 kilometers. Suddenly, a huge truck comes towards him with the headlights illuminating the protagonist's eyes widen in shock. Horror and fear are visible in them. Suddenly, the protagonist is called by a girl. She's wearing a long dress and holding a bicycle. The girl says that smoking is prohibited here. Shin closes his eyes, holding his head with one hand, which suddenly starts to ache. He opens one eye and tries to understand what exactly happened to him, and where he is. The girl in the long dress stands in front of him with a surprised expression on her face. The people in the background are surprised by his carelessness. The guy sitting in the passenger seat coughs and the protagonist goes away. Confused by not recognizing who is sitting next to him, his eyes widen in total incomprehension. It seemed like it was all just a dream. The main character continues to be perplexed by what's happening and suddenly notices something under the incomprehensible gaze of his comrade. He notices his reflection next to the seat where they are sitting. His eyes become even larger and a drop of sweat appears on his face. He wonders if this is some kind of time travel. The boy absolutely doesn't understand what's happening. The dark-haired girl looked awkwardly down, keeping her silence and waiting for at least some reaction from Shin. The protagonist is grabbed by the face. The man says that his behavior is not usual and this should not be done under any circumstances. The unknown tall guy clenches his hand into a fist and says he hopes the main character has a happy future and recovers from a broken heart. The protagonist is annoyed by the stranger's stubbornness and his words. His friend, sitting with him on the bench, is confused and doesn't understand what happened to the young man. Shane bends over holding a cigarette in his hands. The protagonist's facial expression becomes immensely dark, and he seriously and coldly asks the unknown tall guy who he is. Horror is visible on the tall guy's face. From such a reaction, he decides that he needs to leave and says that Shane doesn't deserve so much attention. Meanwhile, the girl just quietly looks on but then finally decides to speak. The girl says that if Shin really wants to ignore her, it's okay, but she made it clear that she doesn't want a relationship now and her opinion won't change anything. Shin looks at her concerned when she mentions that. The girl also says that if he continues, she will tell his mother about his smoking. The protagonist doesn't even remember who his mother is but is afraid she'll find out. He becomes extremely annoyed and doesn't understand how the girl knows his mother. The friend still looks at him with incomprehension and the tall guy is getting angrier by the minute. The girl hands him a water bottle and informs him that he should come to the registration later. She refuses the offer, and the tall guy complains that the protagonist is suddenly acting tough. The girl remains silent and doesn't understand the hero's behavior. She slowly reaches out her hand, in which she is holding a water bottle, towards him. She then leaves the bottle on the bench with a dissatisfied look and turns around and leaves. But Shin doesn't comment on this and observes the girl and the tall guy riding away on their bikes. He asks his friend if he really confessed his feelings to her. The friend puts his hand on Shin's shoulder and asks him to stop pretending. The protagonist realizes that she's the girl he had a crush on when he was a student. He turns his questioning gaze to the guy beside him and asks who he is. His best friend Wang Zibo grabs him by the shirt, shouting that he's his best friend and he always smoked with him. The protagonist questions if he's that Zibo who went to Iraq. This leaves his friend even more annoyed. After a while, they walk down a typical Chinese street, where there are many shops and three-story houses. The friend asks him not to drink too much because of the registration. The protagonist responds that he understands. After a while, they arrive at the classroom. The main character is congratulated for successfully graduating from high school. His teacher, with a slight smile and closed eyes, hands him a graduation notice. His friend is surprised that he passed the first level exam, and Shin mentions that he also passed the second level without any problems. Then the young man looks at his smiling professor called Lao Shu. The protagonist remembers that this teacher won't resist a disease caused by smoking and unfortunately, he won't be able to attend his funeral because he'll be abroad in the future. Meanwhile, Wang thanks the teacher for his attention. Shin at that moment realizes that he really went back in time. Suddenly, the young man notices a red pack of cigarettes on the table next to a pen and a stack of papers. The protagonist quickly takes the cigarettes for himself under the surprised looks of the teacher and his friend. He asks Lao Chu to smoke less. Shin looks at the teacher with a pack of cigarettes in his hand and remembers that teaching in high school is already difficult, but smoking will hurt him even more. The teacher looks at Shin with evident incomprehension, as he clearly didn't expect such words from him. But the teacher lightly tells the protagonist that he will smoke less in the future. The protagonist says he'll take the cigarettes now just to be sure, which leaves the friend and teacher even more surprised. That tall guy is indignant that Shin was accepted into the most important university. A girl tries to defend him by saying that Shin always had good grades, and their conflict is just a misunderstanding. The guy doesn't want to know and continues to be indignant. The girl continues to defend Shin and tries to explain the reason for smoking. The guy interrupts her and calls the main character a criminal and a troublemaker. At that moment, Shin and the friend appeared behind him. Shin approaches the girl he had a crush on and asks where she'll be studying now. The girl blushes a little and responds that she'll be studying at Tungai University. The young man says he'll be studying at the nearby Finance and Economics University. Confused by not recognizing who's sitting next to him, his eyes widen in total incomprehension. The guy beside him tries to humiliate him, but it doesn't work because the protagonist doesn't even pay attention. He asks what time it is, and the girl looks at her watch, saying it's 5:20. The main character takes her hand and asks where she bought the watch. He also implies that this time means, "I love you." The guy forcefully pushes him away, accusing him of trying to reaffirm his feelings for the girl. But Shin doesn't react to it. He decides to leave while the tall guy shouts angrily behind him. Meanwhile, a speaker screwed on a tall pole, where music-like sounds are heard, the rays of the sun shining through the windows illuminating an empty classroom where the Chinese flag stands out intensely on the wall. Shin calmly leaves the school with a notice in his hands, looking at the school children in uniform walking nearby. He looks to the side and sees a crowd of guys playing basketball and trying to throw the ball in the hoop, the school children walking there. They communicate and laugh together, discussing something interesting. The main character looks at the sun that brilliantly illuminates his tired but relaxed face. He closes his eyes enjoying the sun, the last rays of sun that slowly come to an end, giving way to night walks with his best friend. The protagonist thinks that, for the first time in several years, he has the opportunity to go back home. Someone behind them calls his name, causing Shin and Zibo to turn around. They notice the girl Xiao Iggy and the guy he met earlier at school. The protagonist is unhappy to see them again. Xiao rides up to him on a bike and says that he and his friend didn't write anything in her classmate's notebook. The main character silently looks at her, lowering his curious gaze down. Xiao takes a notebook for her classmates from the bike basket. She holds the notebook in her hand and hands it to Shin, asking him to write something as a memory for her. The tall guy looks at the protagonist with even greater irritation and dissatisfaction than expected from his actions, demanding that Shin write something good instead of looking at Xiao. The girl is slightly red and asks the young man to stop looking at her, but the main character makes an excuse by saying that he's just looking at the notebook. He opens the notebook for his colleague and begins to look at what's already written there. The notebook is full of wishes. His attention is drawn to a poem by William Yeats, which the tall guy, called Gal, wrote and put down as his own. Xiao points her pen to the blank sheet of paper in the notebook and demands that the young man write something instead of reading the whole notebook. After that, the protagonist decides to give the notebook to his best friend so he can write first, but the friend still hasn't figured out what to write and is therefore embarrassed, where he writes that he wishes Xiao becomes more beautiful with age. Then the notebook returns to Shin's hands, and he must write something. At least something about it. But other than the desire to remain young, he can't come up with anything. After thinking a little, the main character slowly begins to write his wishes in Zhao's notebook. He writes her a small poem with a wordplay. But the tall guy makes fun of him, and the other girl finds the poem unique. Xiao looks closely at the notebook and notes that the verse is written very well. She warns Xing that she won't tell her mother that he smoked. Gao encourages her to go home, citing the fact that it will soon get dark. Shin and Wang turn as the group leaves. His friend is indignant that he was forced to sign the notebook first. The protagonist teases him by asking if he feels something for Xiao, which his friend immediately denies. They walk together, and the main character suggests going to a burger joint tomorrow. His best friend is very surprised, and Shin explains the choice by saying that he has a family dinner tonight. Zibo looks at the main character and asks if he can skip this dinner. The protagonist turns the corner and leaves the friend alone, saying that he doesn't understand anything. The friend looks at him with incomprehension without saying a single word. The main character walks along the narrow alley that is illuminated by a lantern and signs of various establishments. The young man remembers several moments from his childhood. For example, when he would come home as a child with his school uniform dirty, and his mother would scold him for it. Or when in adolescence, his mother asked him to bring food, but he refused. He also remembers a certain day sitting up late at night with a huge stack of textbooks doing his homework. The main character remembers a middle-aged man at the club flattering him about the future. Shin thinks about his childhood, adolescence, and his future, which he already knows what will happen. The protagonist approaches the red door that's closed behind the metal fence. He looks at this door and stands still. A slight smile touches his lips, and a lonely lamp illuminates his face as he stands at the entrance. The young man raises his hand to the door and begins to knock, demanding that his mother open it. His mother suddenly opens the door, unhappy that he screamed so loudly, and says that he always forgets his keys. The protagonist enters the house complaining that it's hot, and he needs to turn on the air conditioning. As he wonders where his father is, he takes the air conditioning remote control in his hands. His mother reports that his father is still at work. Then she hands the main character a plate with several slices of watermelon. Shin is surprised and starts eating right away. He thanks his mother, and she tells him to eat slowly. While he eats on the couch, his mother asks him to take a shower later and put his university admission documents on the table. The protagonist happily eats the watermelon and realizes that it still has the same familiar taste as before. In a tall building, the lights are on in the middle of a dark night. Shin's mother holds the university acceptance notice in her hand. She smiles proudly and is happy to see her son now as a university student. The main character is in the bathroom listening to his mother's plans for his future life. The woman is already thinking about his graduation from university and grandchildren. The protagonist ironically smiles at himself in the mirror. He mentally speaks that his mother will not see his grandchildren for the next 35 years. The main character is distracted from his thoughts by the noise coming from his apartment's living room. The happy young man leaves the shower realizing that his father has already come home. The protagonist's father stays in the living room and unbuttons his shirt, confirming his return. Despite evident exhaustion, something important catches Shin's father's attention. He takes the air conditioning remote control and adjusts the temperature to keep the family comfortable. Suddenly, the furious mother invades the living room with a coat and a pack of cigarettes. Accusing Shin of smoking, the main character tries to justify to his parents that the teacher gave him cigarettes to pass the exams. But the mother doesn't believe it and accuses the father of not paying attention to the son. The father says it's too early for Shin to smoke, and the mother adds that the father should also smoke less, and it's time for everyone to sit at the table. Now the protagonist's mother and father are sitting on the bed, and she asks to give money to the son to take with him to university. The father says he should let the son go ahead and do what he wants. The mother looks at her husband with concern and complains that as he gets older, the son listens to her less. Although the parents always encourage his ideas, the father observes that the son may not be the best student, but his intelligence doesn't let him fall, and they need to support him. Shin's mother listens attentively to everything her husband says about their son's future. She looks away, lost in her own thoughts about her son. It's starting to dawn on a common Chinese street. The streetlights are still working. There's an alarm clock on the bedside table that signals that it's time for him to get up. The protagonist, without thinking about anything, is partially covered with a blanket. He turns his gaze to the alarm clock that sits peacefully on the bedside table, then looks around the room, especially at the manga on the shelf, and realizes that he definitely wants to stay here. Meanwhile, a strong flow of water flows from the bathroom faucet, and the mother observes that Shin got up early today. The main character brushes his teeth calmly, and looks at his tired mother saying that he's hungry. The mother yawns and says that he can buy his own breakfast because she's going to bed to sleep. Shin doesn't say anything but thinks that this is clearly not the way to raise his son. After a while, the young man approaches a street food stall in a park and asks the price of an egg pancake. After the vendor's response, he's mentally surprised by such a low price and asks for 2 cakes. Shin wonders where the payment code is. The seller looks at him in total perplexity and doesn't understand what code he's talking about. The main character seems to receive an electric shock when he realizes that it's 2002 and you can't pay by mobile phone. And the guy realizes that he doesn't have money with him. His mother didn't leave him anything, and the vendor asks if he's going to buy. The main character refuses and quickly comes up with an excuse that the pancakes are harmful because his grandmother told him that. Then he goes home disappointed, mentally complaining that the payment system and life in the past were extremely inconvenient. Shin is abruptly distracted from his thoughts, paying attention to something in front of him. Xiao is running in a running outfit, clearly out of breath. The protagonist calls her, and she immediately turns her attention to him. Xiao looks surprised, not expecting to see him so early. The girl looks at him and asks what he's doing there so early. It's only 6:30 in the morning. Suddenly, a thought flashes through her head, but she doesn't have time to take the idea that came to her. Until the end, the protagonist greets her, but she quickly interrupts him and says that she knows why he's there. The girl puts her hands on her hips and repeats once again that she doesn't want a relationship now. The main character freezes because he didn't expect such a conclusion from the girl. Xiao assumes that it was precisely to observe her that he got up so early. She looks at Shin with her arms crossed and asks if he was trying to get her attention when he ignored her yesterday. Shin remains silent. He awkwardly gets up and hears the girl say that he's a good guy but she doesn't need a relationship. And only at graduation they can discuss this. The main character realizes that this is precisely the reason they're still not dating. Xiao continues saying that she doesn't want to be distracted. She thinks to herself about the promise she made throughout school that she wouldn't have a relationship. Xiao asks him not to say anything because it's clear, and Shin agrees saying that she's smart. Then he invites her to breakfast where they can talk. Xiao is embarrassed and notes that she should invite him since he helps her a lot with her studies. The protagonist agrees with her and suggests going to a convenience store near the police station that has soy milk and fried beans. He says it will be delicious. The diner has a bright yellow color. There are several police officers and ordinary passers-by. An acquaintance greets Xiao, and she happily and politely greets him back. Meanwhile, the main character enjoys his favorite food. The uncle scolds him, saying that Shin eats too much and doesn't understand the harm of overeating. The protagonist looks at him questioning while eating another cake. The young man affirms that he'll be in perfect shape until he's 30. Xiao asks how he knows that, and he explains that a few days ago he met a fortune teller. So he knows his future for sure and then continues to eat. Shin also said that he'll be rich and successful, but unfortunately without a wife because he doesn't have a marital line. The girl is annoyed and says that this is absurd because men quickly change their minds and feelings. Shin replies that a fortune teller taught him how to tell palm readings, explaining that each palm pattern is unique and shows a person's destiny. The young man observes that the buns made by the owner or his wife will be different. He reports that the owner's buns are smooth, but his wife folds them. Xiao is skeptical about such an assertion. They then turn their perplexed and slightly awkward gaze to the owners of the snack bar to watch them work and make bread. The girl observes the owner and his wife making their own bread. She pays attention to the board on which the bread lies and sees that they really have textures. Completely different forms. She observes this with shock, and at this moment, the main character notes to himself that she has no basic knowledge about baking. Why does the shape of the bread depend on its filling, and that's all the secret? He catches Xiao's attention and reaches out to her. What makes the girl take her attention away from the snack bar owner and his wife? The protagonist, with a mischievous expression on his face, thinks that with the help of divination, he can confuse a person. He reaches out and invites the girl to see his hand. Xiao asks what he's doing, but he says it's just divination. After thinking for a while, the girl finally decides to trust him on the divination matter. The protagonist looks at her hand and explains the meaning of the patterns according to Confucianism. He explains that if the lifeline is long, then you will be healthy and happy. Xiao is surprised by this statement because she did not expect such serious words. From the main character, he marks a wisdom line on her hand saying that she loves to fantasize and also that she will be happy. He calls the marriage line confusing, then says she needs to stay away from guys who run around her and be careful. The young man takes a dramatic pause and says he seems to have figured out who her ideal husband is. The main character looks shamefully at the ground, believing that his reputation is ruined and everyone thinks he is a scoundrel. Xiao also feels strange, realizing that perhaps the protagonist wants to find a girlfriend. She feels very jealous but understands that she can't do anything. Her shoulders droop and she calls Shen by name, getting his attention. The protagonist closes his eyes and sighs heavily, looking at the girl's condition. He opens his eyes and a slight smile is visible on his lips. He then asks if she is angry with him. The girl looks at him with big eyes full of regret, tears, and embarrassment. She looks down tearfully and timidly nods in response. The protagonist says that a lost walk in the park is not a problem, but the girl disagrees by shaking her head. Ibo invites her to come with him to the university or find him later. Then his friend quickly flees, leaving him alone. With the other, Shin is surprised by his friend's action, while Xiao is still silent. The main character calls the crying girl and asks her not to worry and come with him. Xiao quickly wipes away her tears with her hand and agrees to go with the main character. Shin takes most of the luggage, leaving the girl to carry only one bag. He looks ahead attentively and drops the girl off at her dormitory and walks away. The protagonist takes off his glasses and says that his problems are over. He puts his hand in his pants pocket, and the edge of a white piece of paper can be seen from it. A beautiful girl gave him the dormitory phone number, saying that he can contact them at any time. While a dissatisfied girl is in the background, the main character holds the piece of paper in his hands and smiles contentedly, thinking that it is impossible to refuse such a thing. While in the background, a red poster with golden hieroglyphs can be seen welcoming students who look at the main entrance of the university. The protagonist realizes that he really hasn't been here for 10 years. Among the crowd of students walking around the campus, a girl with wavy bangs can be seen. She's in a hurry and suddenly bumps into the protagonist, causing the piece of paper that was given to him earlier to fall from his hands. With noticeable irritation, the main character looks at who bumped into him. The girl immediately begins to apologize, and he cannot help but notice that she is immensely cute. The young man smiles in response to her apology, and says there is no need of this. The girl thanks him and quickly runs away from the collision site, which makes the protagonist shocked. He picks up the fallen piece of paper and tries to remember the girl he just met. Shin continues to walk and thinks about how quickly this stranger fled. At that moment, two people are sitting at a table, an elderly man and a happy-looking girl. When Proto approaches this table, he is asked if he is a student, and the guy confirms this. The girl sitting at the table turns out to be his classmate, whose name is Alano. Then, the girl introduces the elderly man and says that he is a professor named Gogo. The professor tells him to fill out the information and go to the dormitory. The protagonist finishes filling out the paperwork and a crowd of students can be seen gathering behind him. The girl warns that he will live in the third building of the fourth 602. The main character thanks her and says goodbye to the girl and the professor. He looks closely at the various university students, noticing that they are much more beautiful and attractive than the students of his school. Looking at the girls, he understands what attracts the attention of other guys and why they go to this university. He sighs heavily and carries the bag in his hand, now the young man. He believes he needs to make money before trying to find a girlfriend. At that moment, the informational board is filled with various inscriptions and papers, where it is difficult to find a specific announcement, but he finally finds one that suits him and hopes it will help him make money in the future. The sunset sky slowly turns to night, and the lights come on in the dormitory where the main character lives. The young man walks tiredly through the dormitory corridors thinking about how many people there are. Shin smiles happily thinking it has been so long since he was in this room. He puts his hand on the door, opening it slightly, allowing the light to enter the corridor. The main character thinks that for 4 years everything here will surprise his roommates by hearing the noise and turning to the source of the sound in surprise. They ask what Shin is doing, and he says they need to keep the room clean. The oldest suggests making the hero the head of the room, and the others praise his decision on cleanliness. His roommates discuss how much responsibility he will have to sleep, eat, and even resolve conflicts. The protagonist replied that he would have no problem accepting the position, and his roommates looked at him with surprise and admiration. At night, words of praise are heard for the main character for his responsibility and courage. Tomorrow arrives, and the sun shines brightly, illuminating the streets. In the morning, the main character wakes up to the sound of Jim's phone ringing very loudly. Lee tells Shane that he needs to go to class, so he needs a uniform. The protagonist's eyes widen in realization, and he suddenly realizes something important. He jumps out of bed and says that this is the moment to find the girls. Suddenly they arrive outside. Several students dressed in camouflage can be seen in the class. There is a large number of girls dressed in camouflage. The main character says that his classmates are not very beautiful or young, but Shin invites his classmates to meet the girls. Several of his roommates are embarrassed by this proposal and do not respond. The protagonist confidently approaches a crowd of girls and tells one of them that a military uniform serves to allow girls to communicate with each other, and with each other the girl named Hu, with whom he is already familiar. He greets this girl and she is happy he reunited with her. Gal says that he is the only one of the 27 guys who dared to approach the girls. The main character introduces himself and asks if anyone from his Ganges province is here. One of the girls with a ponytail raises her hand and says she's from that province. Shin's roommates are impressed with his flirting skills and say that people like them are always popular. One of the girls says that the first year is very laborious and hopes he can look after his roommates. Confidence is visible in the eyes of the protagonist, and he says he needs to help the professor manage the group. Suddenly, the young man sees the girl he met yesterday and asks Gal about her. Gal says he forgot to introduce her. The girl blushes deeply and steps back. Gal explains to the protagonist that this girl's name is Yushu, and she is his roommate. The girl hides behind Gao's back and then walks away completely. Gao asks not to comment on this and explains that this girl has no parents. Her grades are low, and she is studying on credit. The main character remembers that Yushu was an intelligent student leader. Shin remembers a moment from the graduation ceremony of the university's graduate students. That day, Yushu borrowed an incredibly beautiful dress from someone and shocked the entire university. He remembers the details of the costume and admires the girl's beauty. The young man remembers that their ties were broken in the future, but this time he won't let that happen. Already in the classroom, the professor coughs and draws the students' attention, saying that the meeting has already begun. The professor looks closely at the students in the audience and invites them to get to know each other. A girl with long red hair stands up and says her name is Yen Yen. Shin's roommates start evaluating the girl, and Shin is perplexed by their behavior. Soon the protagonist's attention is drawn to the awkward and timid voice of a girl, and Shu stands close to the board and briefly talks about herself and her home province. Shin's roommates are not impressed with the girl, but the protagonist knows what is hidden under that mask. The teacher talks about the need to choose a group leader as well as a group representative. The oldest among Shin's companions invites him to be a representative, and the second roommate says he can help his friends. Gao focuses and feels that he needs to try harder because there are competitors. She turns to the shy girl and tells her to ignore the guys because they are stupid, and Shu is very embarrassed. Meanwhile, under a clear sky, the teacher's orders, which must be unconditionally followed, are heard. A man in military uniform declares that a guy needs to cut his hair because he is not following the rules. The indignant student defends his appearance and says that others also have long hair. Some students are wondering if they will also have to cut their hair, which is making some girls hysterical. As the girls decide to defend their right to wear long hair, the main character sees the girl Ho run away and decides that he needs to show who the real leader is. He calls the teacher and asks what he is doing. This immediately prompts a reaction from the military instructor. The main character stands with his hands in his pockets while his companions look at him in perplexed shock. Shin introduces himself and says he is a student in the second class of public administration. The teacher still holds the scissors in his hands, but Shin asks him to put them away to avoid problems. The teacher looks at him. With a scary look, he says that long hair is not allowed in military training, which absolutely scares everyone. A guy indignantly replied that no one will cut his hair. But Shin tells him to shut up and explains that the instructor was only invited for training and nothing else. He asks the instructor what his boss would think if he saw him with scissors. The instructor remains silent, and Shin thinks the guy is too afraid of authorities to oppose him. He questions whether students can have long hair and asks to see the rule. The young man says that if there is indeed a rule, he will be the first to shave his head. The instructor remains speechless and confused, not knowing how to respond to the student. After a pause, the protagonist suggests wearing caps so that the hair does not bother them and distract them during classes. The instructor accepts the option. The protagonist approaches the guy who was arguing with the instructor and tells him to apologize. The guy starts to get indignant and says he has no reason to apologize. The protagonist insists, and the guy quickly obeys. Jack awkwardly approaches the instructor and, without looking him in the eyes, apologizes. The teacher closes his eyes, clears his throat awkwardly thinking of something, and then starts forming a group. The girls are grateful for the protagonist's courage, and some of them even show interest in him. Gal takes Yushu by the hand and starts to lead her away from the stadium. The main character asks the companions to form a line to encourage them. The instructor calls the main character by his first and last name, then informs him that the young man smoked and therefore broke the rules. Therefore, he must run 10 laps. The main character becomes darker than a cloud, and one of his companions laughs at this situation. Shin says that one of his companions also smoked, so he must run 5 laps. The instructor decides to punish both, so the two are forced to run 10 laps. After a while, they are incredibly tired of running, but one of Shin's friends praises him for arguing with the instructor. The main character gets irritated and says that Jack's fault was not being able to cut his hair. Jack tries to make amends with the main character, offering his help at any time, as well as a dinner. At this moment, Gal decides to give ice cream to the classmates, and they thank her. The girls eat ice cream and discuss Ho's desire to become the leader, which is why she bribes people like that. One of the girls says the protagonist seems like the best option, but another girl says it will be difficult to discuss matters with him. One of the girls, without thinking twice, says to vote for who they want. The main character understands that it is difficult for the girls to vote for him. He observes the instructor and the teacher standing at a distance and discussing something of their own. The main character decides he will have his own way to achieve what he wants, using more influential and important people for that. At that moment, the teacher asks the instructor to notify him immediately of any problem and offers dinner as an apology. The teacher sighs heavily, clearly not expecting such a situation with the instructor. The teacher is taken out of his thoughts by the voice of the main character offering him a cigarette. The teacher takes the cigarette and asks Shin about the conflict. The protagonist confirms that the conflict has been resolved, and the teacher praises him for his initiative, but does not have time to finish speaking because his phone starts ringing. The main character listens attentively to the conversation and understands that the teacher has personal problems and is overwhelmed with work. The voice on the phone shouts to the professor that he must come and help. Otherwise, he may never return. The professor looks at the phone in shock, and the main character asks if his wife called. Then he says he can take the professor's daughter, although the man has doubts. The protagonist insists on his help, but the professor is afraid that he may not know how to get there, without guaranteeing that he knows the city and has relatives around here. After thinking for a bit, the professor asks if the main character knows where the Goldie kindergarten is. Shane immediately names the necessary route and even describes the area. The man asks if he lived nearby, and the main character says he made guesses. Then he asks the professor to contact the kindergarten teacher, and also says he will show his student ID to verify his identity. The professor hands the phone to the main character and says the meeting will end no later than 7 o'clock. Shin takes the phone in his hands and confidently says that the professor can count on him. Then the young man turns his gaze back to the crowd of students. He looks at Gal, who is talking to other girls, and says to himself that sometimes it's worth resorting to other means to achieve the goal. The young man approaches the kindergarten, and many parents can be seen taking their children home. The protagonist introduces himself, and says he came to pick up the professor's daughter. The teacher is suspicious of Shin and asks to call the professor so he can confirm everything. She calls Professor Gogo and asks if it's true that his student should pick up his daughter. Gogo confirms, and the teacher looks at the main character and says she will ask for the student ID number. She then steps away and continues to listen to what Professor Gogo is telling her. The teacher warns that she needs to name the number. He replied that there is no problem and says all the numbers. The teacher confirms the authenticity of the number and ends the conversation with the child's father. She apologizes for her suspicion, but the protagonist says there is nothing wrong with that. The teacher explains to the girl that the student came to pick her up and will take her to her father. Shin asks the girl to come with him and kneels to be at her eye level. He then asks the child to say goodbye to the teacher. What does the girl do? After a while, they go to KFC for lunch and to relax. He encourages the child to eat more, and by asking her some questions, the girl joyfully eats a hamburger and willingly agrees to answer everything. Shin asks if she knows the teacher's number, and the girl says she doesn't know. The young man asks about the code for pics, but the girl doesn't know exactly what it is. There is an awkward pause between them, and Shin smiles shyly at the child. He then says it's time for them to go home, but the girl asks him to stay a little longer. In the evening, the protagonist informs the professor that his daughter is sleeping. The professor's wife thanks the main character, and the professor himself holds his sleepy daughter in his arms. Shin says there's no need to thank him. The wife gives fruits to the young man as a thank you and invites him for dinner. The professor offers to give the main character a ride to the bus stop. Shin smiles and thanks for the fruits given to him and the kindness shown. Near the university entrance, many students can be seen doing their businesses and sitting on a bench. Shin sits on a bench and smokes. The donated fruits are on the bench in a bag. The protagonist sees Xiao coming towards him and says it's time to sleep. The girl's attention is drawn to the fruits in a bag on the bench. Shaw is delighted with the fruits and asks where the main character bought them. The protagonist says he bought them at a nearby store. The girl listens attentively and is a little surprised by the protagonist's statement. She smooths her hair and asks if he called her just to give the fruits. The main character says those fruits are expensive and asks her not to spend so much money. The girl wants to say something but is interrupted by someone calling her name. She turns and sees a bespectacled guy who says he didn't expect to find her here. Everyone greets him. Xiao mentions she heard he works at the Institute of Geology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The bespectacled guy falls silent and looks attentively at the main character. After a while, he breaks the awkward silence and asks who the boy is. The protagonist answers that he is Shaw's former classmate. He then hands the guy with glasses a pack of cigarettes, but the guy refuses. He covers his nose because he clearly doesn't like the smell coming from the cigarette. He points to the folder with documents and says he has to leave so the professor can distribute topics for them tomorrow. Shaw explains to Shin that they wanted to take this guy to the Academy of Sciences even before graduation. And one day he came to them looking for a lab. The girl looks at the main character waiting for some kind of reaction, but the main character continues smoking. After a while, he still looks at Xiao and asks what happened. The girl looks down and says he offered her to be a lab assistant. Shin is surprised and looks away. The girl says she didn't accept the job. Shin doesn't react at all to this, causing terrible irritation in the girl, who starts getting upset that he is smoking again. The girl says he didn't have this habit before and tells him to think about the future. The young man looks at the cigarette and says he plans to stay with a certain girl. Xiao blushes and asks if the girl is pretty. The protagonist replies that in all his years, he has never met a girl like her. She asks what will happen if the girl rejects him. Shin responds that he doesn't plan to give up. Xiao asks if the protagonist is interested in the opinions of this girl's parents. But he says he is only interested in the girl's opinion. The girl blushes, and her eyes widen in deep embarrassment. She abruptly flees and tells the main character that she needs time to think. Shin scratches the back of his head, clearly shocked by her sudden change in mood. He stands still and wonders why Xiao needs to think about it since he is talking about Yushu. The next day in the classroom, the teacher greets the students and says enough time has passed for the students to get to know each other and choose a group leader. He states that initiative is encouraged so that each student can apply. The protagonist's friend asks him to nominate himself because he already imagined his future. Icho is the first to indicate her candidacy. And one of the protagonist's friends looks at him disapprovingly, thinking he missed the chance. Icho stands up from her seat, and the teacher says he needs to greet the candidate. The students applaud actively for the candidate as she introduces herself and says many students may know her because she helped everyone with the registration. Ichu declares she is enthusiastic and will always help her colleagues in studies and other matters, ensuring a better future for the group. The teacher thanks her for her performance, and applause is heard throughout the audience, with particularly active clapping. The girl returns to her seat, and the teacher thanks her for such a speech and hopes the next candidate adopts the same spirit. Shu looks up and sees the main character passing by. Shin notices her gaze and turns his attention to her, smiling slightly. He steps forward and smiles confidently while the teacher behind him looks at him with interest. Strong applause spreads throughout the audience in honor of the main character. His roommates actively support him and wish him good luck. He starts his speech with a small joke, and the teacher notes how he calmed the audience. Then the protagonist promises to communicate with each teacher before the exam, thus helping the students, and will fight for their scholarships and grants. He mentions there is a significant difference between their university and school, so they need to discipline themselves. And Shu listens to his speech very attentively, especially when he mentions he will provide them with a good future if they choose him as the leader. Finally, the protagonist says the students can vote for him if they believe. The teacher observes that the main character has many advantages, such as organization and leadership qualities. The man writes the voting results on the board, and the students give the final vote to Shin. The teacher announces based on the voting results. With 27 points, the main character becomes the leader. Shin thanks everyone for the votes, while his companions praise him. Meanwhile, Gao reminds Yushu that men are very unreliable, and she should not forget that. The disappointed girl walks through the university campus, thinking everything has lost its meaning. Suddenly, the main character calls the name of his opponent. Gao is dissatisfied, waiting for him to show his new position. Shin states he wants to invite her to dinner because they need to talk. The girl blushes with shame and incomprehension. She then asks if he decided to become a leader to make her fall in love with him. The protagonist replies that he just wanted to discuss the control details with the girl. To prove his intentions, he offers to invite the girl and bring her friend along. And Shu blushes in front of the main character while he says he invited them to discuss something important. Gao states he shouldn't expect blessings from her and her friend. The girl reminds him that a few days ago he invited the guys to dinner but ignored the girls. One day, Gao gets up from her seat and leaves to get food. Shu is embarrassed sitting in front of the main character, but he doesn't say anything. The young man looks attentively at the girl in front of him as if recalling details. He notes to himself her physical qualities and beauty, and Shu finally decides to look at him, but not to memorize for a second. Shin smiles at her in response to the eye contact. His smile grows as the girl burns with embarrassment. Gao returns to the table with a tray full of food and tells the main character the cost of the dishes. They start the meal, and the girl asks him what he wants from her, and what the essence of their meeting is. The protagonist says he has something important to discuss with her. He then states that he wants to give her the position of chief. The incredulous Jaein asks if the main character is really going to transfer the position to her. She questions if he's going crazy. Shin asserts that he's fine, but he wants to find out. Why does Gao want to be a leader? He's interested in her motives. The girl, after thinking for a bit, responds that she wants to help the students, but the main character doesn't believe her. Gao awkwardly averts her gaze as if caught red-handed and exposed. She says she wants to become a civil servant in the future, so she needs the experience of a leader. It's valuable in such a job. The protagonist understands her reasons and realizes she needs a career, while the girl fails to understand why he's asking this, and what her true goals are. He states he's only interested in money, and the girl mentions she has no connections. He explains that thanks to this position, her influence would increase, and the girl notes that it's an excellent tool to achieve her goal. When Shin asks if their opinions align, the girl tries to say no. Meanwhile, Yushu eats in silence and listens to their conversation. The protagonist states he only needs this position for a year because he's not interested in being a leader, and Shu is very embarrassed by this situation, so she thanks for the food and wants to leave. But Shin says in an arrogant tone to the girl to go back to her seat, causing the girl to panic. Gao begins to actively defend her. The main character pushes a plate of peeled shrimp towards the girl and says he bought it especially for her. The girl twists in surprise, but Shin asks her to finish it and points to the plate with his hand. In a panic, the girl says she doesn't need him to do this for her. Gao watches this whole situation with confusion as the main character asks why Shu refuses. Shrimp. Gao is truly disgusted and can't understand what's happening. Shin looks at her with embarrassment. Some kind of resentment can be noticed in his eyes. He leans towards her, takes her hand in which she's holding a pastry. Then, the young man asks if it's really so tasty and requests to try it. The girl is in shock. The main character tastes the pastry and declares that it doesn't taste bad. But the girl still can't get over the shock and looks at him with wide-open eyes. Stuttering and sweating, she tries to say something to the protagonist, but is interrupted by a Gal's shout calling the protagonist. A Gal doesn't understand this reaction and says they still need to cooperate. At this moment, the girl is boiling with anger, and her friend is burning with total embarrassment. Tilting his head slightly, the protagonist mentally says he always considered Yannian the prettiest in the group. But now he says he understands who is really the prettiest in their group. Gao says this is a kind of strange and incomprehensible evaluation, Then the girl says that few people know about you choosing the true appearance and beauty. So the main character must keep everything secret. Because Shu is very shy, and her friend is afraid she might encounter bad people, the protagonist agrees with this without any problem. But asks not to look at him so closely when talking about bad people. Gao replies that men all have the same thoughts. The main character thinks he took the right strategic step and decided to continue establishing relations after a brief pause. He says it's worth continuing the conversation. The young man offers a deal in which he says in his second year he will give up the leader position. But the girl asks what guarantees he can give her in this regard. Shin offers the following plan. During the first year, she can support everyone by gaining attention and creating a pleasant image among teachers and students. She can also join the advisory squad, which will help her pass exams. Gao believes the main character is trying to blame her dirty work. Shin tries to convince her that everything that belongs to him will belong to her. She asks what else he can promise. The protagonist looks with a confident smile and says they can share responsibilities with her in charge of smaller matters and him in charge of the bigger ones. The girl looks at him skeptically and asks what will happen if she refuses the deal he's so actively trying to offer. Shin says in that case, he will work even harder so she has no chance. After such an attack, the girl is speechless. The protagonist says he will help her in all matters. The girl looks at him with growing irritation and says he's clearly lying to her. She then says she clearly won't do that, showing her open disgust for him. Shin tries to take advantage of his charisma and resting his chin on his hand says he's always honest and sincere with everyone. The girl abruptly jumps from the table and agrees to the deal, also telling her friend and Shu that it's time for them to go, and Shu agrees softly. The protagonist is very happy that his plan worked out and he was able to convince her. After many days in a red and white establishment, the voices of the students can be heard celebrating the end of military training. Students actively toast their glasses. Although there are many different classic Chinese snacks on the table, Gao says Xiao needs to eat more and that they can meet more often since their colleagues study at universities close to each other. But the girl rejects her concern. The protagonist's best friend sits next to him with an unsatisfied face. Shin asks what's wrong with his mood. His best friend complains to him that in his finance university, there are 62 people in his group, and only 2 of them are girls. The main character looks at him wide-eyed and asks about those 2 girls. Instead of answering the question, his best friend silently continues drinking, as if he doesn't want to respond. The protagonist, sympathetically understanding his situation, tells him to continue drinking calmly without worrying about anything. Meanwhile, Xiao says the university is about studying, not relationships. But Ibis says if there are girls available in his specialty, then it's better for her to remain silent. Gao invites Shin to sit closer to Xiao and asks his opinion about her. The protagonist touches Dao's shoulder while reaching for the chopsticks. He apologizes for his actions in the process, leaving Gao and Xiao in complete shock.